Yamamoto probably should have been a special war power, right? I mean, all signs point to yes. The guy wipes out 5 Sternritter in the space of about half an hour, after embarking on a vengeful, murderous rampage, and as we discussed at length in a video looking at just how many of the Sternritter the head captain could have possibly killed had he survived, well, safe to say, it was quite a lot of them. There's no doubt that in terms of potential raw impact on the overall war itself, it definitely feels as though Yamamoto deserved to stand alongside the 5 vaunted Shinigami whom Yhwach specifically designated as possessing power and ability strong enough and uncontrollable enough, crucially, as to potentially stand in the way of the Vandenreich achieving total victory over the Soul Society in the Great Soul King War. Hell, he was certainly more dangerous than Kenpachi. And yet, as we all know, Yamamoto wasn't considered a special war power. In fact, Yhwach looked down on his ancient enemy in a pretty dismissive and unceremonious way. Despite the fact that Yamamoto was responsible for Yhwach's initial defeat and the complete collapse of the Lichtreich Empire over 1,000 years prior, Yamamoto also represented an enormous failing in Yhwach's eyes. A transformation of the core ideology of the Gotei 13 that resulted in their ultimate demise in the modern day, both literally and figuratively, at least as far as Yhwach was concerned. In today's video, I want to take a closer look at how the relationship between Yamamoto and Yhwach changed, how that was reflected in their respective empires, and why, despite still wielding immeasurable power by the time of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, Yamamoto was simply no longer seen as a threat by the Quincy King. So let's dive in. It's strange, Yamamoto and Yhwach share barely a few pages worth of panel time together in an arc whose very namesake was born out of their previous battle and the endless war and resentment that's followed it ever since. And yet so much character and conflict can be attributed to this central dynamic between the two leaders. It's extremely important, and of course it's for this reason that I've always wanted more, as greedy as that sounds. More backstory, more context, more insight into that fight from 1,000 years ago, as it really does lay the foundations for, well, everything. Even the anime, for everything it did add, didn't necessarily tackle this fundamental disagreement at the nexus of everything beyond the reaches of the manga. That being said, at the very least, the anime did show us their fight, or some of it anyway. While the manga reveals that Yamamoto used an early version of his bankai against Yhwach, the anime shows us just how the head captain massacred Yhwach's original Schutzstaffel in a tempest of hellfire, before the Quincy King himself prepared to face off against the head captain in what appears to be a last stand. We have no idea how much of a fight the two of them truly engaged in, and if we're to take the anime's representation of this battle at face value, which maybe we shouldn't, but Sasakibe stabs Yhwach through the back almost immediately, just as Yhwach challenges Yamamoto, allowing the head captain to then deliver an incredible, if nebulous, blow with his flaming sword. So as you can see, truthfully, we know very little about the original battle between Yamamoto and Yhwach. We know that Yhwach, having conquered much of the medieval human world and transformed it into his Lichtreich, set his sights on the Soul Society next, angry not just at what had become of his father, but at the state of the Quincy race as a result of the world his father seemingly created. Despite his rage, however, as we see in the anime, he would lead his troops to a near total defeat, without the Almighty to assist him after it was sealed by his stealing of the Soul King's left arm. Well, Yhwach walked right into disaster, and his entire empire was almost totally annihilated, to the point where the Lichtreich effectively ceased to exist on Earth. Yhwach survived somehow, We still don't know, we still need to see that immediate aftermath, and somehow ended up in a seemingly catatonic sleep state for the next 1,000 years, while the surviving remnants of the Lichtreich escaped into the shadows of the Serete, abandoning their empire on Earth and instead forming the Vandenreich hidden in the dark, waiting now for their king to return. It's clear then that when Yhwach finally awoke and once more set his sights on destroying the Soul Society, he realized that the Gote 13 that greeted him this time around in this new age were considerably different, considerably more disappointing, and certainly not what he had expected to see. And this belief of Yhwach's is laid out for us in chapter 511, one of the most pivotal chapters of the entire arc. Before we continue, if you haven't yet hit subscribe, do consider doing so today. It's quick, it's easy, it's free to do, and it is greatly appreciated on our journey to 300,000 subs by the end of the year. It's only going to be possible with your help, so if you haven't done so, if you're new here, if you just haven't hit that button yet, do consider doing so now. We'd greatly appreciate it. The core conceit of Yamamoto and Yhwach's relationship is laid out for us, like I said, in full in chapter 511, Die Standing, where Yamamoto is killed by Yhwach at the end of the first Quincy invasion, in some sense putting a capper at long last on that original battle from 1,000 years ago. In chapter 511, Yhwach towers over a defeated but not quite dead Yamamoto, his boot pressed upon the old man's head. The Quincy King starts to monologue the difference between not just the two of them, but intrinsically the difference between this Yamamoto and the Yamamoto of old, and by extension the Gote 13 of today and of yesteryear. And he does so by framing his argument around his decision to not label Yamamoto a special war power. Because of course, going back to what I said at the start of this video, if we take an outsider's perspective, a more objective look at the situation, realistically the head captain should be one. He should be a special threat from the perspective of overwhelming raw power. That same raw power that could have feasibly wiped out all of the Sternritter. But the thing is, that's not what Yhwach was worried about coming into this battle. That's not what he's prepared for, at least not in this sense. He's prepared for it in other ways, in ways that literally mean Yamamoto doesn't have to be classified as a special war power. Yamamoto was an open book. I mean, sure, the head captain was absurdly strong, so strong that Yhwach did have to prepare. He did have to devise a scheme to weaken him first. But the very fact that it was doable, it was quantifiable, to the point where it physically could be circumvented via an actionable plan, was the first step to understanding his enemy, to the point where he didn't need to label him a special war power or a special threat. But of course, all of this stems from a much deeper, and in Yhwach's eyes, a much more sickening issue eating away at the core of the head captain like a disease, a complacency, and even worse, a benevolence that has festered as a result of the Soul Society's victory over the Lichtreich 1,000 years ago, that has infected Yamamoto and crippled him over the centuries that followed. Yhwach's earlier perception of Yamamoto is something I would have liked to have seen more of, or at least anything of, in a flashback, because it seems like Yhwach not only respected the Yamamoto of 1,000 years ago, who ruled over the original Gote 13 with an iron fist, and led them as little more than a pack of brutal killers, but as a result of that, he feared him too. However, you never really get a bona fide insight into that version of Yhwach, as he only plays a pivotal, but truth be told, small role in the Friend Saga, and then there's nothing else really to go on, save for his words here in chapter 511. But anyway, Yhwach straight up asks Yamamoto why he thinks he wasn't made a special war power, because as I said, it seems obvious to do so. We all assumed he was one pretty much right up until this moment, in fact. It's kind of funny to think, though, unless the concept of special war powers existed in the battle 1,000 years ago, Yamamoto hasn't ever heard this term until now, so he's probably lying there face down in the dirt thinking, what the hell is a special war power? Although I guess, maybe it's obvious enough, but the funny part to me is that no one has access to Yhwach's personal criteria for this label, so Yamamoto has literally no idea what that would necessarily contain. Anyway, truth be told, I do think there's an element of spite here, obviously, in Yhwach not making Yamamoto one of these threats. It's to prove a point, that the Gotei 13 has grown weak and stale under Yamamoto's aging, ineffectual leadership, and the majority of the actual special war powers do reflect this line of thought in some way. Ichigo wields a new power unlike anything ever seen before, and has a well of power that they cannot quantify. Aizen's immeasurable Reiatsu, again, that probably cannot be quantified by the Vandenreich, comes as a result of him breaking boundaries. Kisuke is a dark horse who, while ostensibly a Gotei 13 man through and through, is willing to do whatever it takes. And Ichibei is, well, the font of all knowledge and the man closest to the Soul King. Ichibei's kind of an interesting one in that sense, because I wonder if in the Daten, it explicitly says, like, Ichibei Hyosebe is a special war power, but none of you should engage him because none of you stand a chance, only I do. I wonder if it says anything of the sort. Really, again, I'm not trying to dunk on him, but only Kenpachi doesn't make any real sense to me. Sure, he's immensely strong and an expert fighter, but he's so straightforward that him being a special war power is a little odd to me. The special war powers were chosen because they were deemed the 5 Shinigami whose impact on the war could not be quantified ahead of time. They are the wild cards of the Gotei 13, essentially. And I don't really feel like Kenpachi fits the bill. Or maybe he does, but then Yamamoto definitely does as well, which again leads me to believe there is a lot of spite influencing this decision. Also, to make matters weirder, Kenpachi is made a special war power based on his early 1000-Year Blood War arc self, not even based on the post-Unohana version. So again, that's a little weird. But when berating Yamamoto's weakness, Yhwach uses the primary example of the head captain choosing not to restore his arm, choosing not to ask Orihime for help in doing so, and instead wanting to keep the humans out of harm's reach, even trying to protect Ichigo in the middle of the battle with Aizen. This is a far cry, of course, from the Yamamoto of old, who used his subordinates however he felt was necessary to get the job done. Yhwach readily admits that the original Gotei 13 were monsters, but that's why they courted fear, and that is seemingly very valuable to a warrior like Yhwach, to be feared. What's so fascinating about Yhwach and his mindset, and then by extension the Vandenreich, is how Yhwach clearly embodies that medieval age. He is a reflection of the old version of Yamamoto, who we never got to know, brought forward to today, who believes in the ideals of power and ruthless conquest above all else, willingly using his subordinates to get what he wants. And of course we see this in real time through the use of the Alsvalen in particular. Yhwach notes with a bitter disappointment that Yamamoto used to be the same way. The deaths of his subordinates meant nothing to him. And it's interesting because Yamamoto tries to distance himself from Yhwach's way of thinking here, earlier in the fight. When Yamamoto takes out Asnod, Basby and Nanana, he says to Yhwach, "Your callous disregard of your men, that hasn't changed." And yet later on, in that same fight, we find out from Yhwach that Yamamoto used to be the same way. But what I also find to be so interesting about this dichotomy is the fact that while Yhwach seemingly embodies that older way of thinking, as I just explained, the Vandenreich itself actually embodies the modernization of the Quincy race. They have advanced and evolved, while the Gotei 13 hasn't. The Quincy, through the Vandenreich, have experimented with occult powers and technology, and have gained strange new abilities as a result of intertwining themselves further and further with their god king. And this is of course all in service of standing up to a race that's frankly stronger than them on paper, the Shinigami, and it's really thanks to this advancement that they are able to stand a chance against them at all, through the use of the Shrift, through bankai stealing, through Quincy Volstendish, for example, but these are all smart moves to make if you're going to try and win this war. In fact, I would argue that this idea of the modernising, evolving Quincy's is, well, pretty much laid out for us in the Soifon versus BG9 battle, when she is surprised to see BG9 using a minigun, claiming that she thought Quincy's only used bows and arrows and maybe they aren't such savages after all. Of course, there's more to Yamamoto choosing not to restore his missing arm than simply involving the humans. Mairi literally has a drug on hand, the Hoji Kuzai, that could have done the job instantly. Instead, in the wake of the battle with Aizen, Yamamoto clearly didn't feel that there was a need to restore his arm, and so he could leave it gone as a monument to what happened, perhaps even to his failing. Yamamoto's body is covered in scars from his battles past, so clearly he likes to keep those memories alive. After defeating the Lichtreich, the Gotei 13 has known true peace for the last 1,000 years. Sure, there have been conflicts, Aizen for example, but nothing really compares to full-scale war with the son of the Soul King. And over the years, the Shinigami have grown tired, lazy, and ineffective, and Yamamoto has remained at the head of them throughout this decline. Would Yamamoto have restored his arm had he known for certain that Yhwach was about to return? When it comes to Yamamoto, though, what really changed? Yamamoto was the oldest Shinigami around, having founded the Gotei 13 and lived for thousands of years. The present-day Bleach narrative takes place over the course of maybe 3 years tops at best, so realistically, Yamamoto just isn't going to have that much in the way of character development. He's been an immovable object for however long. So what I like about the way Kubo illustrates Yamamoto's evolution is that it's quite subtle. It's explored in the ways Yamamoto himself affects change throughout the Gotei 13, in its laws and its mandates and the way it evokes its power. Let there be no mistake, Yamamoto is still a hard-ass. In the Soul Society arc, he is arguably defined by his blind devotion to tradition and authority, to the point where he was going to execute Rukia simply because it was the law passed down by the Central 46, and even tried to fight Kyoraku and Ukitake to do so, his surrogate sons, even though he himself openly admits that Kyoraku has the ability to see the truth of things. Yet he doesn't listen to them, he doesn't value their insight, he does not want to hear it. The Yamamoto of the later arcs feels, subtly, like a totally different character almost, and that's quite effective. His change is brought about in small but palpable ways, from preparing to draw his sword against Shinji when meeting them again in the Fate Karakura town, to offering the Vizard a position back into the Gotei 13, to being ready to kill Rukia for transferring her power to Ichigo, blindly ignoring the fact that justice wasn't being done and that suspicious circumstances were clearly afoot, to working with Kisuke Urahara and Exile to bestow powers upon Ichigo once again, something that is a flagrant violation of Soul Society law. And there are smaller character moments too, sparing the lives of the Trebistia due to being impressed by their tenacity, to worrying about having to hold back against Wonderweiss due to him being a child. Meanwhile, Yhwach hasn't been privy to any of that kind of growth. He's gone from hating the world and wanting to conquer it, to rewrite it essentially, to, well, that again. That being said, even if Yhwach hadn't found himself in a comatose state for a millennia, I don't think he'd have changed in the same way. He doesn't seem capable of it. He's a bloodthirsty warlord, but worse than that, he genuinely sees himself as a god, who believes his people live and die purely for him. If there ever was a speck of care within him for the Quincy race, and it kind of seems like there might have been once, it appears to have been mostly snuffed out by darkness by the time of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc. Perhaps the coolest aspect of this dynamic, though, is what Yhwach fails to see, that there's still an element of the old Yamamoto alive and well, and that it is possible to balance the two and be an effective leader. Yamamoto was prepared to potentially annihilate the captains with Enetsu Jigoku to kill Aizen once and for all, for example. What is interesting, though, is the way Yamamoto's development plays into the narrative of Bleach. At the end of the Lost Agent arc, a big fuss is made over the fact that Ichigo's unrelenting, unflinching sense of self is what helped to transform the Soul Society's millennia of thinking, and that's certainly true to some extent. For some characters more than others, like Byakuya for example. However, if Yhwach is to be believed, this change was born in Yamamoto long before Ichigo arrived, and has been bubbling beneath the surface ever since, growing within the head captain like a cancer, at least as far as the Quincy King sees it. Maybe Ichigo's arrival was indeed the final catalyst for Yamamoto, the final harbinger of true change. And of course, speaking of true change, it's no coincidence that the Gotei 13 ultimately wins the war once Kyoraku becomes head captain. But again, there's more to it than that. Yamamoto's loss in the first Quincy invasion doesn't just come about as a result of his now more lenient ways. That's what Yhwach would want you to think. But it also comes about because he starts to revert back to his old self and loses himself to both anger and revenge, completely losing sight of the truth as a result. In that sense, Yamamoto was almost doomed to lose. There was no way he could win, as the old were fated to be swept aside for the new, and therefore there was nothing he could really do about the inexorable march of time and change. And yet in doing so, his unwitting sacrifice was the catalyst the Gotei 13 needed to win the war in the end. Alright everyone, that's it for today's video. I do hope you enjoyed it. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Do you agree with my take here? How do you feel about the relationship between Yhwach and Yamamoto? I'd love to get your thoughts down in the comments. I'd love to read them. Let me know how you feel about whether or not we might see more of their original fight from 1,000 years ago, or perhaps as far as you're concerned, we've seen enough of it already. Do let me know your thoughts on all of this down in the comments below. I really would appreciate it. Once again, thank you so very much for watching. Consider hitting subscribe if you haven't done already to help support the channel on our journey to 300,000 subs. Again, it's only going to be possible with your help, so please do consider doing so today. It's just a press of a button, and it does mean absolutely everything. And also consider checking out the Patreon as well. The link is down in the description if you want to take your support for the channel that extra step further. Again, that is making a huge difference in helping to keep the lights on here on the channel. Again, I do massively appreciate it. It means so very much to me. And you, like everyone on screen right now, can help to really take that support for the channel to the next level. So again, thank you all so very much. Alright guys, well, until next time, we'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.